Good morning. The committee will come to order. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and a special thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Reliable and affordable high-speed broadband connections are a vital aspect of doing business in this day and age. Sadly, at least 25 million Americans still lack access to high-speed internet, many of which live in remote parts of our country. We all realize it's more difficult and expensive to build out broadband networks in these areas, but that's no excuse to leave them behind. To do so results in a divide between our urban and rural economies that reduces economic opportunity for millions of Americans and small businesses. In fact, more than 26% of Americans in rural America lack access to high-speed broadband compared to 1.7% in urban areas. And people that live in these towns across the country notice. 58% of rural Americans believe that lack of access to high-speed internet is a problem in their hometowns. In my home district, at least 37,000 people don't have access to a wired high-speed internet connection, and 9,000 don't have a wired connection at all. As we will discover through this hearing, the problem is likely much worse, as these numbers come from counts that overestimate both coverage and speeds available in rural communities. To achieve parity across the country, Congress must work to coordinate federal resources and make common-sense investments in targeted infrastructure projects. To do this, the federal government must have accurate data to ensure that funds and resources are efficiently allocated to expand coverage to unserved areas. Effectively mapping our current broadband is a necessary and obvious step. However, the current state of broadband mapping is unacceptable at best, I would say. There is strong evidence that the percentage of Americans without broadband access is much higher than the FCC's numbers indicate. Even the FCC chairman is on record recognizing the lack of accurate and granular data. The chairman has stated he will introduce an order in August to address broadband mapping. In doing so, it is imperative that the FCC develop rules that require large carriers to submit reports with more granular data. For example, instead of using census blocks, carriers can submit coverage reports based on much smaller census tracts or submit shapefiles instead of Form 477 data. But greater granularity is not a silver bullet. Robust and in-depth authentication of broadband coverage data needs to be conducted to assess whether communities are truly connected. In Maine, along with Minnesota, we're using publicly available data to develop more accurate maps on behalf of the federal government. Members of this committee have heard from constituents across the country about slow download speeds and spotty connections. My home state of Maine has the second slowest broadband speeds in the country. Without access to reliable internet, small firms in rural areas miss opportunities to connect with new customers and can't take advantage of cost-saving tools like digital payment processing and online distribution services. Finally, children in rural areas also need access to high-speed broadband to utilize cutting-edge educational tools so we can usher in the next generation of tech-savvy entrepreneurs. This is something the ranking member, Congressman Stauber, and I talked about in a field hearing in Minnesota, and this is actually in his area, and I'm sure in mine too, become a bit of a real estate issue. It's something that's critically important. People want to buy homes and live in areas with access to broadband internet. We can no longer accept that rural means digitally disconnected. Private investment is not enough, and inaccurate maps are a major barrier to the efficient expansion of broadband networks across the country. I hope that today's discussion will shed light on ways to improve data and accountability in broadband mapping. I look forward to working with my colleagues in Congress toward developing accurate broadband maps and bridging the digital divide. I thank each of the witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. I would now like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Stauber, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, and thank all of you for being with us today. I appreciate your time and your interest in our hearing. As we all have witnessed in the last decade or so, modern communications technology has provided infinite opportunities for small businesses, and particularly new and exciting ones to small firms located in rural America. The growth of the telecommunications industry and the advances in the way we communicate with each other in recent history has been nothing short of amazing. Because of this rapid advancement, we have seen a revolution of sorts for small businesses as well. Small firms communicate with potential buyers around the world. Family farmers use wireless technologies to monitor and maximize their crop production. Entrepreneurs can launch a website from just about anywhere. and with the use of the now commonplace smartphone, can accept payments from anywhere there is a wireless signal. Most importantly, these new technologies provide the gateway and opportunity for economic growth and job creation, especially in rural America. Today, more than 24 million Americans lack access to high-speed internet, the vast majority of whom live in rural communities. In my home state of Minnesota, specifically, over 400,000 people do not have access, and those that are lucky enough to have access may only have one provider to choose from. Just last month, Chairman Golden visited my district and held a field hearing with me, with my fellow committee members and Minnesotans Jim Hagedorn and Angie Craig on the digital divide and how we can work to ensure better broadband access to rural areas. At that hearing, we discussed that in a world where choice seems abundant, many Minnesotans are left optionless. When comparing urban and rural broadband deployment, 97.9% of urban America has access to both and mobile broadband, while only 68.6% of rural citizens have that same access. We cannot continue to leave our constituents behind just because they choose to live in rural communities. Since 2011, the National Broadband Map has been a tool for consumers, businesses, policymakers, and researchers by providing a searchable way to find out who is offering broadband, what types of broadband they are offering, and where they are offering it from. But the mapping platform has become dated, as has the coverage data. The current map has been widely criticized for overestimating how many people have access to high-speed internet. Because the FCC uses the maps to determine where to devote billions of dollars in broadband investment, the issue has drawn intense scrutiny from people who say they are being overlooked. At an oversight hearing earlier this month in the Senate, FCC Chairman Ajit Pai announced that in August, he will circulate an order to update the method in which the FCC constructs the map to make it more accurate and be a better indicator of where we should invest. Today, our panel of telecom providers will help us understand what goes into creating the map and how we can make it more accurate to ensure we invest federal dollars in the right place. Thank you all again, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. And if committee members have opening statements, we would ask that they be submitted for the record. I'd like to take just a quick minute to explain the timing rules. Each witness will get 5 minutes to testify, and members will get 5 minutes for questioning. There's a lighting system to assist you. The green light comes on when you begin. The yellow light means there's 1 minute remaining. Don't panic when that happens. And the red light comes on when you're out of time. And we ask that you stay within that time frame to the best of your ability. But we won't shut you down immediately. If you have a quick point that you need to wrap up, please feel free to do so. And I'd now like to introduce our witnesses for today's panel. Our first witness is Mr. Tim Donovan, the Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs at the Competitive Carriers Association, the leading association representing competitive wireless telecommunications providers. Prior to joining CCA, he served as the Manager of Government Affairs for the Direct Marketing Association, where his primary responsibility was supporting the advocacy goals of the direct marketing community. Mr. Donovan holds a bachelor's degree from Providence College, where he studied English and political science. Welcome, Mr. Donovan. Our second witness hails from Pottsville, Iowa, and will be introduced by the gentlelady, Ms. Finkenauer from Iowa, who is the chairwoman on the Subcommittee on Rural Development, Agriculture, Trade, and Entrepreneurship. I would now like to yield to Ms. Finkenauer to introduce our second witness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of your subcommittee today. This is actually not one of the ones I sit on, and so it means a lot to me to get to be here and introduce one of my constituents from Iowa's 1st Congressional District. I'm very proud to introduce Dan Stelpflug, who is on the front lines working to provide high-speed broadband service to families and small businesses in Iowa. Mr. Stelpflug is the Director of Operations, Engineering, and Technology at Elmicky Clayton Electrical Cooperative. Mr. Stelpflug manages the AC Skyways Broadband Division, responsible for deployment of new technologies and the overall strategic vision of the department. Unfortunately, many rural communities lack high-speed broadband because of the cost to carriers to provide in these areas. In turn, this hits small businesses that need high-speed broadband to identify new customers, sell their products, and create jobs in our communities, which are very important, especially in our rural areas. Federal grant and loan programs are designed to deploy broadband to underserved areas. To target the assistance to where it's needed, though, we do need accurate maps that are drawn from granular data and vet it by robust processes. I look forward to hearing Mr. Seltflug's perspective on this issue, which is so important, as I said, to our small businesses back home in Northeast Iowa. Mr. Seltflug, thank you for coming all this way to Washington and making sure that your voice is heard. And I just want to also take the moment to say thank you to all of our witnesses here today. Having you guys on the record, telling Washington why this matters, it means so much and helps us do our job in a better way. Thank you, guys. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. And our third witness is Miss Beth Osler, who hails from Unity, Maine, in my home district in Waldo County. Ms. Osler is the Director of Customer and Industry Relations at Unitel, which serves approximately 5,000 homes in rural Maine. She was born and raised in Bangor, Maine, and later attended Bates College. We're both alum of Bates College. She was first employed as a cord board operator for New England Telephone Company. Over the next 50 years, she's held positions of increasing responsibility in operator services, customer service, regulatory affairs, and legislative affairs for both large and small telecommunications companies in Maine and in New Hampshire. Welcome, Ms. Osler. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I now would like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Stauber, to introduce our final witness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And our final witness today is Jason Hendricks, the Chief Regulatory Officer for the Range Companies. He serves on the Board of Directors for WTA, Advocates for Rural Broadband, for which he is testifying on behalf of today, and the Colorado Telecommunications Association. He is also the past president of the Wyoming Telecommunications Association, and Jason has been in the telecommunications industry for 23 years. He began his career at the Illinois Commerce Commission, then consulted for GVNW Consulting before joining the Range Companies. Jason has a Master of Arts degree in Political Studies from the University of Illinois Springfield, a Master of Science degree in Economics from the University of Wyoming, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Economics from Penn State. Thank you for being with us today. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. We're now going to go ahead and move to testimony, opening testimony from our panel. We're going to go out of order very quickly because Congresswoman Finkenauer has to get over to a Transportation Committee hearing, but wants to hear the opening remarks of Mr. Seltflug. So, sir, we will now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the committee for the opportunity to be here to share our small business perspective on the importance of more granular and accurate broadband mapping. My name is Dan Seltflug, and I'm the Director of Operations Engineering and Technology at Allamakee-Clayton Electric Cooperative in Postville, Iowa. We provide electricity to less than 10,000 rural consumers across 8 Northeast Iowa counties near the Wisconsin and Minnesota border. ACEC is part of a broader electric cooperative industry represented by the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association that serves 1 in 8 Americans and covers 56% of the U.S. landmass. In part because cooperatives are led by and belong to the communities they serve, there is an increasing number of electric cooperatives studying whether they should be part of the solution to close the digital divide. More than 100 electric cooperatives, including my own, already are working toward meaningful and diverse solutions to bridge the digital divide and jumpstart local economies. In addition to my operations and engineering responsibilities at ACEC, I oversee AC Skyways, the broadband division of our cooperative. We have been delivering broadband to Northeast Iowa residents since 2014 using a combination of fiber optic lines and fixed wireless technologies, a fiber to the section wireless to the home business model. The primary impetus for ACEC's investment in its broadband network was and continues to be to serve members who lack affordable options to access internet with at least 25 megabit per second download speeds. My cooperative's experience with shortcomings and inaccuracies of existing federally available broadband mapping data is from the perspective of a broadband provider seeking opportunities for federal funding and as a provider working to meet Federal Communication Commission's requirements as a FCC Rural Broadband Experiment grant recipient. Our first experience with inaccurate data occurred while working to comply with federal grant guidelines. In 2014, we received a grant from the FCC's RBE program. The grant was awarded for us to reach 665 potential customers in 209 census blocks with broadband. The potential customer total was identified by FCC data that was assumed to be correct. While preparing progress reports required by the FCC, we discovered a discrepancy in the number of potential customers. Instead of 665 locations, as indicated by FCC data, we counted 510, or 23% less than anticipated. My written testimony outlines the process we undertook and includes graphics demonstrating differences between FCC-provided data and what we discovered to be true on the ground in our service area. In addition, it is important to address concerns with the FCC's Form 477. We believe the FCC's existing Form 477 data overstates the availability of broadband, particularly in rural America. The concept that a census block should be deemed served in terms of fixed broadband service if one location in a census block is served is just no longer viable. Another frustrating aspect of the Form 477 data is the reporting requirement allowing carriers to report advertised maximum speeds in a census block, even if they can only provide that high speed to one customer. While the devil is always in the details, there are steps the FCC can take to vastly improve broadband data availability. First, more granular data is needed to eliminate the false positives in classifying census blocks as served or unserved. Second, the FCC needs a system of checks and balances to help ensure providers are reporting actual speeds that are reliably available to consumers. Lastly, federal agencies must undertake increased data verification efforts, including the implementation of a challenge process. We appreciate members of Congress working to solve these issues through legislation such as the Broadband Data Improvement Act of 2019 by Representatives O'Halloran, McMorris-Rogers, Butterfield, Custer, and McKinley. Electric cooperatives know how challenging it is to build infrastructure throughout rural America to provide a service that is integral in the prosperity and future of our communities. More accurate mapping showing broadband availability are a key part of reaching all rural Americans with high-speed broadband service. This will enable us to clarify existing gaps in coverage and harmonize the diverse solutions that will be required to help rural Americans keep pace with their urban counterparts. We look forward to a continuing partnership with Congress to work toward that goal. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, sir. And we would now go back in order and recognize Mr. Donovan for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Chairman Goldman, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the need to produce more reliable coverage maps. Mr. Chairman, you are correct when you recently noted that this is a gravely important issue that creates barriers that prevent rural small businesses from reaching their full potential. These maps have been called many things. Useful is not one of them. We must have reliable broadband coverage maps to meet the challenge of closing the digital divide. CCA is the nation's leading association for competitive wireless providers, representing nearly 100 carrier members as well as vendors and suppliers. Through the recent FCC Mobility Fund 2 challenge process, CCA members have firsthand experience and motivation to fix the mapping process and continue deploying mobile broadband services. It is an exciting time in our industry, as mobile connections power new technologies and improve the quality of life across the United States. 5G will supercharge these services and enable new services, some not yet even imagined. Current and future technologies depend on robust wireless networks, and without the right policies, rural America will be left behind. Today's hearing is not only important, it's also timely. Chairman Pyle recently announced that this August, the FCC will vote on a report and order on updating broadband maps. I hope today's hearing can help inform that process. We cannot close the digital divide if we do not know the country's existing coverage gaps. I'm pleased to join the committee to continue the discussion on how to produce reliable maps and to support the policies small businesses rely on. You know that the representation of coverage in the current maps in your districts is overstated, and in some cases substantially so. The FCC and agencies across the government must work in coordination with industry to produce the most reliable coverage maps possible. The stakes are too high for anything less than our best efforts. I'd like to take a minute to talk about how we got here, as well as offer solutions for a path forward. Historically, the FCC's Form 477 has served as its tool to determine the availability of services and to guide policymaking. However, current policies are not adequate to allocate USF support. As recently as December, the FCC used Form 77 data to report that, quote, approximately 100% of the American population lives in geographical areas covered by mobile LTE. This is wrong. If this were accurate, we would not be having this hearing today. Mobility Fund Phase 2 will provide $4.53 billion over the next 10 years to preserve and expand 4G services. The FCC decided to undertake a new one-time data collection to determine areas initially eligible for this support, acknowledging that using the data to determine eligible areas would prolong any challenge process. To the FCC's credit, this data collection included specific parameters. While taking steps to standardize the data should be commended, we now know that the parameters selected did not sufficiently improve the accuracy or credibility of the resulting coverage maps, which continue to dramatically overstate coverage, especially in rural areas. This is a significant problem, as the challenge process proved to be overly burdensome yet insufficient to correct flaws. The problem is particularly acute for small entities. That must marshal resources or reassign staff to conduct challenges rather than focus on deployment. The takeaways for this process for challengers were twofold. One, the process was so complicated and expensive that challengers large and small were never able to challenge all the areas they wanted to. And two, absent a successful challenge, too many unserved areas will remain ineligible for support. Mr. Chairman, in Maine specifically, one CCA member collected millions of data points but could not successfully challenge 55% of the area they would have challenged because of a lack of roads and resources. Your state was not alone. Despite these problems, entities last year provided the FCC with over 20 million speed tests to challenge claimed coverage. After a preliminary review, the FCC launched an investigation into the data while suspending the next step of the challenge process. The investigation's findings can help improve future data collections, but we already know that more robust standardization is necessary. Any model will have shortcomings, but to produce maps that are more reliable, the FCC must ask carriers to provide a detailed radio frequency link budget submission that includes the most relevant data, including signal strength standardization, increased cell edge probability, increased cell loading to more accurately reflect how mobile networks are used in rural areas, and additional clutter factors. Further standardizing these bottom line factors will produce substantially more reliable maps and reduce the need to expend additional resources to correct data collection flaws. In conclusion, connectivity for millions of Americans living in rural areas and the small businesses that rely on those connections depend on policy decisions that are based on reliable real-world data. Thank you for your ongoing leadership on this critical issue and for holding today's important hearing. I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Osler, it's your turn for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Golden, Ranking Member Stauber, members of the committee. My name is Beth Osler, and I work for Unitel Incorporated, a very small telecommunications company in Unity, Maine, somewhere between freedom and hope. I'm here today representing not only Unitel, but also NTCA, the Rural Broadband Alliance, of which we are a member. And they have over 850 members who are small companies throughout the United States. So I'm very proud to be able to represent them today. One of the good things we can say today is that there's no argument about whether there's a problem or not. And we all know that the problem exists, that it's particularly difficult in rural areas, and even from the remarks this morning, we all know why it's happening. You cannot make a business case to invest in an area where there aren't enough potential customers for you ever to make a return on your investment. And so what we do is we fall back on the ability, hopefully, of finding private and public partnerships where we can all work together to come up with a business case that actually works. And that has happened several times in Maine, and we want it to happen a lot more. Funds are limited, so you have potentially funds at the local level, although I would say that's where they're most limited. At the state level, and we've been working hard to try to make those funds available through our agency, Connect Maine. And as you know, at the federal level. And we all know, too, I believe, that even then, the amounts of money that could be used for this purpose do not completely make up the need. So what happens with maps? Everybody, I think, tries to do their very best to provide accurate data, but because the data is at such a high level, at the census block level, the ability to actually determine where there are unserved and underserved areas is often impossible. And so what we do is we end up with false positives and false negatives where FCC says there is service and we know there isn't service, where the FCC says there isn't service when we know there is service. And as you can imagine, that makes the distribution of funds pretty difficult. So we need to make sure that these limited funds are used in the most efficient and effective way. So we have kind of three things we'd like to share, and I don't think they'll probably be much different from any of the other witnesses. One, you definitely need more granularity at the map level. We're perfectly interested and want to help to make that possible from our perspective. There have to be reporting standards. If people don't know exactly how they're supposed to report, or it's unclear and they misunderstand what they're supposed to do, that's going to add to your errors. And obviously, there needs to be a challenger validation process, which is not working now. So for example, we had 6 census blocks where the FCC said there was broadband service. We said, no, there's not. But we were ineligible for any support because they claimed that they were, and we couldn't challenge that. So those 3 areas of consideration about mapping are probably where you will get the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak. So we look forward to working with you and anyone else that we can work with to make sure that happens. We want our customers to have good service. Thank you for letting me testify today.
Of course, ma'am. Thank you so much. And finally, Mr. Hendricks, recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Golden, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the committee. My name is Jason Hendricks. I'm providing testimony today on behalf of the Range Companies and WTA. It's a pleasure and an honor to testify before you this morning. The Range Companies are comprised of the parent company, Range Telephone Cooperative, and its subsidiaries, RT Communications, Du Bois Telephone Exchange, and Advanced Communications Technology. The 4 companies provide broadband service in rural areas of Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and South Dakota. Our combined serving area is approximately 30,000 square miles with a customer density of 0.54 customers per square mile. Despite the low density and high cost challenges of our serving areas, we provide very high-speed internet service, including fiber-to-the-premise service in many of our communities. But like most rural providers, we have some areas that are cost-prohibitive to serve with speeds comparable to those found in more densely populated areas. It is these areas for which the accuracy of the broadband mapping is most important and for which the current FCC mapping mechanism is the least accurate. My testimony focuses on goals to improve broadband mapping without being overly burdensome to small providers with limited resources. The current broadband map is derived from data reported by broadband providers twice a year in Form 477. Problems with the current broadband map include use of advertised speeds rather than actual speeds, lack of granularity through the reliance on census blocks, which can be very large in rural areas, overstatement of availability when entire census blocks can be shown as served if only a subset of it is actually served, understatement of availability due to a delay from when information is provided to when it's shown on the map, the use of inaccurate customer location data, and regulatory burdens associated with data collection. Between our 4 companies, we're required to provide broadband data on over 7,000 census blocks. Yet census blocks can be upwards of hundreds of square miles in size and are often ill-fitted to population clusters. For example, we're required to provide data on a census block that is 366 square miles with 19 locations. I'll provide you with an example of the problems that can occur when census blocks are used to determine broadband availability. RT Communications serves the town of Hewlett, Wyoming, which is near the nation's first national monument, Devil's Tower. RT provides 100 megabit service in town, but there are locations outside of town that we haven't been able to serve with speeds of 25 megabits per second or more due to the high construction costs. We have looked at pursuing grants to defray some of the construction costs to serve those locations. However, the large census block is considered served because it includes a small portion of a well-served town. Where a better mapping system used, the outlying locations could be properly identified as unserved so that the funding could be targeted to locations in need. Similar examples can be found throughout our serving areas. The range companies are supportive of efforts to achieve more granularity in broadband mapping to ensure that broadband funding goes to areas most in need. We offer 4 goals for a new broadband mapping system. First, we request that the reporting requirements not be overly burdensome for small providers. Second, we request that the mapping methodology be used for all state and federal funding decisions so that providers are not subjected to reporting requirements that differ across jurisdictions. Third, the process used to verify the accuracy of the data should be meaningful and minimally burdensome to small providers. Fourth, a streamlined challenge process should be used to ensure broadband availability is not overstated and the support's going to areas of need. 2 mapping proposals are gaining traction, involve the use of shapefiles and location fabrics. We believe these proposals need not be mutually exclusive and both can be adopted over time. In the near term, we are supportive of the shapefile proposal. It can be easily accommodated with our existing mapping capabilities. It can also be more representative of network architecture, community boundaries, and the locations of outlying customers and rights-of-ways. And it can be overlaid on multiple types of premise location platforms. We're cautiously optimistic about the location fabric proposal. We're fully aware of the errors contained in the current location databases, and we're hopeful that a more accurate database can be developed. We're looking forward to the results of the pilot project on the proposal. We do believe, however, that the shapefile reporting process can be created and used prior to the development of a customer location fabric. With respect to the FCC's order that's due in August, I will be working with WTA to provide comments to the FCC in advance of the order's release to be consistent with the positions I provided in my testimony today. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hendricks. Very quickly, before we move to questions from members, I'd like to submit this letter from U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association, for the record without objection, so ordered. Okay. At this point, we're going to go ahead and move to member questions, and I'm going to start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Hendricks, I had some good follow-up for you, but I'm going to hold off, and maybe we'll come back to you later, because I know that we've got 2 members up here from Minnesota who I'm sure want to have some back and forth. Including Mr. Stauber, who should be back very quickly. First, Ms. Osler, I thought I would ask you, it seems like you've spent a lot of time working, or trying to work at the local, state, and federal level and pulling different resources together, and I've seen that repeatedly across the state. So I wanted to ask you, you know that last year the FCC decommissioned the National Broadband Map and came out with a fixed broadband deployment map, which uses the FCC Form 477 submissions. It's been criticized as overstating coverage, as you've heard, and I think agreed yourself. And Earlier this year, NTIA announced a pilot program among 8 states to include Maine and Minnesota to collect broadband to update the national broadband map. What role do you think states can play in helping the federal government get more accurate data, working at the local level and state level? And what kinds of barriers are there to doing it? Do you need resources or help?
Thank you, Mr. Golden. I think the closer to the ground that you get, the more accurate your data will be. And so I think it can only be better if the local state folks do their part to help make the federal data accurate. I think that it's likely that there'll always be errors. We're human, and everyone is, I hope. So there are always going to be errors, and that's why we should also have a consistent way of letting people know when the data is incorrect, and a way for it to be accepted and verified and made appropriate. We all look forward in Maine to working with whoever can help solve this problem, because it is affecting us and will continue to affect us more and more as we go forward.
I appreciate that very much. It I think strikes both the ranking member and I that there's a lot of different programs that Congress has put forward, whether it be through USDA or other areas. Things are rather spread out, but you can create these great programs. But if you're creating barriers to accessing them in terms of these, mapping requirements that hold people back, first you've got limited access to those resources, and secondly, this issue of being able to challenge that information with that local data that you're collecting seems to be a real significant problem, and one that I hope we can work on. It's upsetting to hear that there's not a robust back and forth where you can go to the federal government to feed the information that you're working hard to gather on behalf of your people.
Yes, and the more inaccurate the maps are, the more frustrating it must have been for the FCC to try to come up with a way to fix it. I think they got overwhelmed probably, but there's got to be a better way to do it. And I think that part of it is getting down into the data further, so that those kind of overriding errors they spread essentially, because if you have one error that shows someone in a census block when they're not there, then not only is that location wrong, but everything in the whole census block is wrong.
Thank you for that testimony. I appreciate it. Real quickly, I'll throw this one over to you, Mr. Donovan, and anyone can jump in. We only have a minute, though. But this issue of advertisement speeds and just one person being able to get a speed, and all of a sudden you can advertise that you've got this wonderful coverage. It reminds me of truth in advertising type issues. Do you think there's any work that needs to be done to try and make sure that companies are advertising accurately what you can expect?
Chair, I think it's both what you can expect as well as where you can expect it, especially when you're talking about mobile service. People expect your cell phone to work that's why you buy a mobile device. And so getting into some of this fundamental data, as my colleagues on the panel were talking about, as a starting point is necessary before you can layer anything else on top of that.
Thank you. I'm just about out of time, but I would say quickly, we heard this in our field hearing in Minnesota, and we're doing another one up in Maine in the fall. But a big manufacturing company talking about how the speed advertised would be sufficient for his business, and perhaps the speeds are there when there's low usage late at night, but when it's time to do business and people are at work, the speeds just aren't there as advertised, so it's a significant problem. I did want to point out before I cut myself off and hand it over to the ranking member, for those of you that are in the crowd, in the audience, or listening in back home, Miss Osler from Maine, if you're looking for a wonderful place, you heard her talking about Waldo County, Maine, with such friendly town names as places like Freedom, Hope, Unity, and Friendship. It's actually Waldo and Knox County, but just an amazing, wonderful part of the country, and the names of the towns speak to it. So with that, I am out of time. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us, and I would now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Waldo County sounds like the entire state of Minnesota. Thank you. So, Chairman Golden, I want to just publicly thank you for coming to our state, my state of Minnesota, to have that hearing. That generated a lot of interest. And as you know, one of the questions I asked to the business owner is had he known when he started the business, would he locate in that same spot with the lack of internet access? He said, absolutely not. And that's rural Minnesota. And I think the four of you, I want to thank the four of you here because you understand that rural America matters. And that's a district that I'm fortunate to represent. And your testimony today is congruent to that thinking. And so the expansion of broadband, the deployment in rural America, we bring our businesses, and I feel it's a choice of quality of life. And just the opportunity to be able to have that small business anywhere in this country you want, it's so important. So my first question will be to Mr. Donovan. You know, couldn't we get better maps by leveraging government to help collect more and better data? For instance, there are federal employees that roam all over the country, probably all of whom carry a mobile phone. Could an app or a program run an automated coverage scans while carrying out their regular duties? And would that help gather a deeper understanding of what coverage looks like in rural America?
Thank you for the question. So, yes, federal employees could collect this data, and that would be particularly useful in verifying where coverage does and doesn't exist. The question before on the speeds available too, that also speaks to one factor that's measured in this called the loading factor, where if people are using the network heavily, you're not going to get the same speeds. And so as we're building these maps, it's important that the FCC sets that right loading factor to actually reflect how people are using these networks in rural areas. That while it's useful for verifying based on the employee's usage, I still think we need to start with more granular data coming in from the carriers. You can then push some of the burden. Part of the problem when the challenge process was the burden was all put on small entities, on state and local governments. If you start with better data, you can verify it through programs like what you discussed with federal employees and shift that burden away from state and local government or private entities to prove the negative where they know that there isn't service.
Thank you very much. Ms. Osler, our committee consistently hears from small entities that the federal government should not adopt a, quote, one-size-fits-all data collection to mapping purposes. Can improving the broadband map be done in such a way that the smaller telecommunications have an easier time of it when compared to the larger ones?
I think it's perfectly fine if there are different ways of gathering the data. My company has 25 employees. We know where every single building is in our property. We would love to just be able to tell people that, and I think a lot of small companies could do that too. The issue to me, though, is that over and over again, when there's an error, it would be so easy to fix. And so the validation, the ability to challenge, which seems like more of a negative word, but the opportunity to work together to make sure it's correct.
And I like that word, the opportunity,
Right.
to be able to, fix or bring data that challenges what you've been given or what you've been shown by the bigger telecommunications company. So to the four witnesses, this is a map of Minnesota that says that a great part of Minnesota is covered. This map to me is not accurate. There are places that say it's covered. I know I've been there, it's not covered. And so I think the accuracy is so important, and that's why you bring from your business experience, that rural mentality, you bring part of the equation and part of the answer, and I think a big part of the answer. Because we know that I'm not concerned so much in the metro or urban areas, the big places in Minneapolis or St. Paul or Rochester maybe, or even in the center of Duluth, which is the biggest city in District 8 in Minnesota. The concern is you have the ability to help augment the map when it's wrong and bring some solutions to us. And I'm just, before my time runs out, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here and that it matters. Your experience, you have just as much knowledge and experience as some of the bigger companies, and we need that. And our goal is to invite you into that process. As you said, Ms. Osler, the accuracy matters. So, and my time's running out. I've run over. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and we would now recognize Representative Abby Finkenauer, the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Rural Development, Agriculture, Trade, and Entrepreneurship.
Well, hello there. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for letting me to sit in on this subcommittee today, and thanks again for everybody being here. Mr. Stepflug, thank you again for traveling all the way from Iowa's 1st District. And, you know, I know in your testimony, you compared the digital divide to the struggle that rural America faced, nearly 80 years ago when the U.S. began deploying electricity. As a person with many years of experience in the electric industry, what were your experiences in developing networks in remote areas, and what are some of the lessons that we can learn from that process that you want to make sure that we hear loud and clear?
Some of the areas, when we started building our broadband network, I'm from an REC, and we built the network that covers 56% of the landmass of the United States. And we used a lot of community development folks to help us out to get things started. We have groups of people that come together that say, if you can get broadband to our area, we'll serve you, or we'll provide the customers. So, they're giving us some solutions to some problems when we question how many customers we can actually get. So we're taking a similar approach to the way the broadband is expanded out. And it's an expensive venture, and we have to do it in a prudent manner, or we just can't afford it. So we rely on a lot of these communities to help us out with that kind of thing. Yeah. Everyone is kind of coming together as a group to work toward a common goal. We have a small town in Alameda County that is a county seat that doesn't have adequate service. And, it's a town of 3,000 people. And the city contacted us, their economic development people, asking if we could expand service to their area. And they volunteered to send out surveys and that type of thing to find out what coverage would be, to see if it would be a viable option for us. So that's kind of an example of the way the communities are asking us to help them out.
Great.
And we're taking that same approach as we did with the electric lines years ago.
Okay, thank you. And wondering too, if you could make sure again that Washington hears, a little bit different perspective. I always take every opportunity I get to remind this committee that our farmers are also small businesses. And as much as obviously we need broadband and rural broadband to attract small businesses to our main streets in rural Iowa and rural areas across the country, our farmers also rely on this because of precision ag and how technologies are changing. So I'm wondering if you would be able to touch on that too, given the rural nature of Alameda and also Clayton County and how important that might be.
Yes, it's very important to the agricultural community. Everything from the dairy farmers to the crop farmers that are looking at real-time markets and are making plans as far as their budgets are concerned, and they need to have good internet access to do it. And we have a lot of areas that it's just not available. And they are in some pockets that are really not very populated, and it's hard to justify extending to some of these areas. But these farmers are really dependent on this stuff, and they're kind of falling behind just because they don't have access to these markets. We hear of people that go to local libraries to do work on some of this stuff to figure out what they're going to do. They're in a tough spot, and to stay competitive with everyone else in the country, they need access to broadband.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Stepflug. And I have just a minute left here, so this is just to the whole panel. Obviously, we have increasingly seen how small firms benefit from broadband access, and it's actually hard to imagine how any small business would survive without the internet, including our farmers. To the panel, how can we encourage more businesses to adopt the technology and take advantage of the innovations brought by faster broadband? If anybody wants to touch on that, Ms. Osler?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I think one of the things people don't talk about a lot, and I know we're talking about mapping right now, but is that there are a great many small businesses who don't understand what the use of the internet could do for them. We did a survey a few years ago in our territory, and 40% of the small businesses, a lot of them at-home businesses, did not even have a website.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Wow.
So I think there's a wonderful opportunity, and we at Unitel have actually been doing this, of providing digital literacy training, not only what you want for service, but how to use it. I mean, we had people in those classes that we had to teach how to turn on the computer. And then we had other people who wanted to learn how to use QuickBooks and so that they could run their business from home. This is a wonderful opportunity that we are looking forward to taking advantage of.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Osler. And I know my time is about to expire, so I just want to say thank you again to all the folks here. And thank you, Mr. Chair, again for letting me sit in on this meeting.
Happy to have you join. Thanks for coming. We now recognize Representative Jim Hagedorn from Minnesota 1.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing. I appreciate that you and Ranking Republican Stauber made it up to Minnesota. That was a good hearing, and I think this continued hearings on the subject can be very, very important. And I pledge my support to all of you. I think everybody in the room is on the same team. We want this to work. We want to help out the folks in rural America and make sure that the people that happen to live outside of big cities have the same opportunities as the Congressman Stauber said, as the folks in the big cities. And it's just it's a basic infrastructure issue. I mean, let's face it. I agree with my colleague from Iowa. This is a lot like the RAs and delivering that last mile or two of electricity to the farms out there, make sure everybody was up to speed on that. Roads and bridges, sewers, water, whatever it is. And now it's broadband. And this is just a quality of life issue. And it's something that we have to keep pushing and make sure it gets done. And it's very critically important for our folks out there in our counties. So, when we were at that hearing up in Minnesota, the Congressman Stauber's constituent, small business guy, and he's talking about, he's right, if he had to look back and do it all over again, he probably wouldn't even have tried. And there's a lot of opportunity costs out there that we're missing. But there are businesses in rural communities right now that would like to expand. And they're like, you got to look at what's the cost of labor, what's the cost of this. Do I even have broadband service to the point where I could do it, expand my operations? There are probably bigger sized businesses that would like to move into parts of southern Minnesota. And they're like, we're not going to fiddle with it. We're just going to go where it's taken care of. So whatever we can do to move this along, like I said, you have my support. I agree with Pete, looking at this map of the district, of the 1st District, Minnesota, and it says here 98% is covered, but then you look at what real speeds are, maybe only a third, and you can't do business that way. And then when you get down, you're looking in the future, and you have a lot of folks in rural areas, veterans, others, elderly people, and they want to do telemedicine. So maybe they don't have to travel 50 or 100 miles, or they can get care right away. It could be also people with mental health care and things of that nature. Doctors need to be able to see the charts. You need to be passing things back and forth. You need to make sure that it all makes sense. And for our farmers, a lot of livestock out there fed every day with mechanizations, all run by the internet. That goes haywire, doesn't work. That's rough on the animals, rough on the operations, and so we got to get it right. Mr. Hendricks, I liked what you said about making sure that whatever they do in the future, that we don't have onerous regulations and things, that the burden would be borne too much by small business, by the smaller telecommunications companies and others that are delivering this. Do you think it's pretty important that when we have businesses in these areas, that they're the ones that can do the service, that they're the ones that are going to be in those communities long term? Or what are your thoughts in general on making sure that we protect the small businesses that are doing this work?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And just a clarification that your question on small businesses, the small providers that are doing the work in the areas, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's very important. We care about the communities we serve. We live in the communities. it's not just a profit maximization thing, it's a serving the community thing. And for us, if we can have a methodology to provide broadband mapping that fits in with our current systems, which I think the shapefile proposal does, I think that makes sense. I think that you'll end up solving a lot of the issues that you guys have been talking about as far as knowing individual areas. You'll be able to put a shape file, for example, around a town. That area is well served. Maybe a community outside of town, you put a shape file over that, or a polygon, I should say, and maybe that's at a lower speed. And then in the more remote areas, they can be signified with lines and dots. And I think that fits in well with capabilities that we have for a small business.
Might know the area and customers better, might have more of an interest in making sure that it gets done right, and that the people are serviced long into the future, because they're probably going to be doing business there for a long time. Mr. Donovan, real quick, when they figure out these speeds and they say potentially 25, 3, whatever, is that just per person, or is that per every 100 users, or how do they do it?
So for wireless service, it's based on a model. You put in these different factors, and then this is what the minimum speeds you get. And the factors that you use make a real world difference. So as a quick data point on that, if you allow me a few more moments, in the Mobility Fund data collection, they required wireless carriers to report where at 80% of the cellage, so where the distance is where you have an 80% likelihood of getting the speeds. We now know that that's too low. So carriers build to at least 90% cell edge. Public safety is 95%. That 10% difference turns out into a 27% difference in the circumference of the cell service and a 60% difference of the area covered. So that 10% ends up being a huge area that claims that their service where it actually is not up to those minimum speeds.
So they should upgrade some of those standards.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now recognize Representative Mark Vesey from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today to discuss the need for better and more comprehensive mapping of the current availability of broadband across the USA. And as someone that has heard a lot about this issue, and as a matter of fact, I signed on to a letter led by my colleagues on another committee that I serve on that questioned the data relied upon by the FCC to determine where and how extensive broadband deployment is across the U.S. Coming from the state of Texas, where there is more rural area than urban area, it is important to ensure that rural residents are able to participate in and benefit from our increasingly technology-reliant society. And I represent all urban Texas. But again, in order for our state to continue to grow and prosper, this is a hugely important issue. I am old enough to remember going to my cousin's grandparents' house out in what we call the country, out in Palestine, Texas, and where they still didn't even have indoor plumbing back in the late 1970s and 80s. And people don't realize how long it takes for rural America to oftentimes get connected to the rest of what's going on in the world, and this is very important. Mr. Donovan, in your testimony, you spoke about the FCC allowing a load factor of 30%, which failed to accurately reflect mobile broadband in rural areas. Given the increased reliance on mobile devices in many rural communities, do you believe that tightening the FCC's parameters, as mentioned in your testimony, will have the effect of helping close the digital divide between rural and urban areas?
Yes, sir, and thank you for the question. So if you have that load factor set too low at 30%, then people aren't actually going to be getting the speeds when the network is actually in use. And this isn't only a small carrier issue. Even Verizon in the record noted how nearby to your state in the panhandle of Oklahoma that speeds or load is consistently above the 30%, that it's only there about a third of the time. And that's because people are reliant on their mobile devices to connect to the internet, as well as the fact that rural sites are more likely to be served using low-band spectrum. Low-band spectrum is great because it travels long distances. You need fewer towers to build out, and so in areas with low population density, it's what you want to use. The trade-off of that is lower capacity. So to make up for the way that those sites are engineered, you need to have a loading factor that is at least 50%, if not higher.
Would these tightened parameters create an incentive for more funding to be invested to increase mobile broadband development in rural areas?
Yes, so they would help make the correct areas eligible for support, as well as help give you a more reliable picture of what the need is. Until we have a reliable map, we support all the discussions of making additional funding available for building out broadband and mobile services in rural areas. But until you know the size of those coverage gaps, it's really hard to determine what amount of support is necessary to close that.
We know that reliable broadband allows for friends, families, and businesses to stay connected, as has been articulated here today. Can you talk a little about how affordable, high-speed internet improves the lives of people living in rural America and making these towns a more attractive place to live, work, and raise a family? As you know, one of the things that you hear about in rural America, at least all around Texas, and I'm sure around the country, is that they actually have a hard time keeping a lot of their talent there. Kids go off to college, get educated, and then they don't want to come back to these towns because there's not a lot of opportunity. Can you talk a little bit how bringing broadband out to rural areas may sort of help them economically and even be able to retain some of their local talent?
Sure. So, at one of our recent trade show conferences, the CTO for one of our rural providers was asked the question, what do rural Americans want out of 5G? And the answer is simple. It's the same thing as everyone else. We've heard talk today about telemedicine, and a fifth of the population lives in rural areas, but only about 10% of the physicians. If you want to get them the care they need, we need to make sure that you have broadband access. Ranking Member Stauber mentioned payments. Just last weekend, I was in Western Maryland, an area that looks like it's served on the map. Turns out it's not. Standing at a table for a local foundation, and the gentleman in front of me in line said, do you accept cash or credit? And I said, accept credit if it's going to work. That's not reliable enough for somebody to conduct a business, and for somebody who is used to having connectivity is not a viable place for them to go and then to locate and try and start a business or raise a family.
Wow. Well, thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yield back the balance of the time.
Thank you, sir. And we would now go ahead and recognize Congressman Troy Balderson. He's the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Innovation and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here this morning. My first question is for Mrs. Osler. In your testimony, you mentioned how the rural nature of service territories can cause unique difficulties in providing service. During my time in the Ohio State Legislature, I would hear how something as simple as a ravine or a forest line could prevent accurate maps from being constructed, greatly reducing broadband service capabilities. How can government work better with the private sector to ensure the most accurate map is created? First is the first question. The follow-up to that would be, and what can the FCC do to engineer the most granular maps?
Thank you very much, sir. I think we've kind of touched on that, and that is that we have to use a deeper level of data. And I think, for example, shapefiles might be one of the ways to do that. I know we already use shapefiles to get data to the state as to where we provide service. Just a quick story. One of the state senators in Maine called us and said, I have a business that wants to locate here, but they said they can't because there's no internet service where they are. There was fiber running right in front of the building. So there are all kinds of problems with not having accurate mapping. She was able to explain to him that he could get whatever he wanted. In my community, we have fiber to the home. How do we do that? We got help from the state to leverage the investment. So they gave us several $100,000, and we invested $1.2 million more, and we were able to run over 200 miles of fiber. These are the kind of things that after you do that as a business person, if it doesn't show up on the map, it's kind of annoying, and it's very frustrating for customers. So the map, everything comes back initially to the maps. From there, if you have accurate maps, from there you can do all kinds of things. But without that accuracy, you get people off on tangents and making decisions based on inadequate or erroneous information.
I promise I won't have a tangent, but the ranking member also showed, and Representative Hagedorn, I mean, these are very, very misleading and very, very inaccurate. So hopefully we can address that issue. Thank you very much for your answer, though. My next question is for Mr. Hendricks. In your testimony, you talk about the inability for Americans to challenge the speed being advertised to them and the speed that's being delivered. How can we enable Americans to voice their concerns without creating additional burdens for smaller telecom providers?
Thank you for the question. With respect to being able to look at it, I think there's two parts. There's a proposal called crowdsourcing, which would allow people to do speed tests and then report it as their own verification. And I think that's an important thing to allow and to consider. I did caution in my written statement about over-reliance on that, because there can be some inaccuracies whenever you're talking about customer devices within a home on networks that we don't control. It can result in an understatement of what the speed availability is. But if there are a bunch of data points showing consistent things, then yeah, I think that should be considered. As far as the second part, which would be a challenge process, we are fully in support of a challenge process to allow any entity to challenge that broadband is available in a certain area or not available. So before any funding decisions are made, there should be an opportunity to allow people to challenge the accuracy of the map, particular providers who may be impacted by the funding decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you very much for that. Do you have any interest in asking any more questions? All right, you all set?
Yeah,
All right, I'm going to go ahead and go into an additional round, and we'll let Mr. Stauber start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to reiterate what I said. You know, one of the statements here is this new map will be born out of the collective efforts of small telecos, large telecos, and the FCC. You folks matter. You need to be at the table, and I want to ensure you that the chairman and I will make sure you're at the table to represent rural America. You have experience. You understand, as Ms. Osler said, you know where it's at, where it's not at from being in the community. And I just can't reiterate enough to you, please work with us, give us your suggestions, because the chairman and I want to make sure that your rural experience is brought into this mapping process to make it better. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, with that, I think we've covered pretty much all of it, looking through your testimony and the back and forth of the questions. We could keep going, but as Ms. Osler just indicated, you know, I think often we end up coming back to the same responses here, and there's good reason for that, because your testimony has been excellent, and we appreciate it very much. Geez, I can't help but say that just last week I was having a bit of an issue with government in talking about how important accurate information is. In this case, back home in Maine, having to do with lobstermen. It's no different here with the FCC. We need to expect that the government is going to have the most accurate data and information available in order to make decisions. We owe that to the people of the country. It's maybe perhaps out of fashion to legislate in great detail, but then when we hand things off to federal agencies to implement the intent and will of Congress, it requires a lot of oversight. That's what we're doing here. We appreciate you coming in, and we will continue to push to try and get the FCC to work more closely with you, because you are like boots on the ground, little force multipliers that they should be working with to get more accurate information and data rather than kind of butting heads with, so to speak. We could go on and on and on, everyone up here and all of you, and probably a lot of other people, about all the stories about how broadband access just isn't cutting it in rural America. So I'm not going to go off on a tangent. I would love to, but probably could pull 10 stories out of my pocket right now, but this is an important issue. I want to thank everyone for working together on it, building up to this hearing, but also going forward, because there's a lot of work to be done, and we look forward to working with all of you. I want to thank the committee staff as well for all the work that's going into this, and it's not just the work that went into the committee, but following this issue closely and helping make sure that we're in a good place to make some real progress. Not enough to pass a new grant program. We got to make sure that it is effective and implemented in an effective way, so that it's actually benefiting our small businesses, our families, and communities back home. We know how important this is. It's a major issue to unlocking opportunity in rural areas in the remainder of this century and going into the future. Accurate maps. It's we can't spend money on investing in infrastructure if we don't have accurate data. It's like you said, Ms. Osler, the limited resources require that we spend it most wisely. So thank you all very much for being a part of this. I would ask that we have unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. And without objection, so ordered. And if there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you.